Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Braulio Rosa. I'm the Executive Director of the Broward County Bar Association. I'm pleased to have today with us Dr. William Alexis. Dr. Alexis is being interviewed along with other doctors in celebration of Black History. This year, the 17th Judicial Circuit, Broward County Bar Association, and the TJ Reddick Bar Association are honoring the first responders in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Alexis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let's get right into it, Doctor. Question number one. Describe your medical specialty. Why did you choose that specialty?
Sure. I'm a clinical and interventional cardiologist. And so that refers to a specialty that deals with the prevention as well as the treatment of cardiovascular disease. So everything that involves the heart and the blood vessels of the body. And so I do both non-invasive as well as invasive work, doing things like angioplasty and stenting for folks that have blockages in arteries, for example.
Wow, that's over my pay grade. What special challenges exist for Black doctors in South Florida and in the nation?
Sure. I'm not sure that the challenges we face in South Florida are necessarily unique. I think our challenges are probably pretty national, and I think that the most pressing ones, of course, are first of all just being able to have the opportunities to begin the path and complete the path to becoming a physician. But in terms of actually the practice of medicine, I think it's really being able to reach our communities and being able to actually effectively treat not only the patient who's in front of you, but hopefully make an impact in the community to improve on some of the healthcare disparities that we know exist and ravage the Black and Brown communities in the United States.
Talking about that, that's actually a perfect segue. Can you describe the medical care disparities and treatment among the Black community?
How much time do you have?
As much as you want, doctor.
Yeah, obviously that is a very large topic that many have spent lots and lots of time researching and trying to address. And your question, of course, we all know and understand that there are some pretty dramatic health disparities that affect specifically the Black population in the United States. And there are a number of reasons for that. Everything from the impact of racism and socioeconomic disparities that lead to certain pre-existing health conditions, but also being able to actually access medical care that would improve a lot of the disparities that we see. And so as one particular kind of relevant example now, we'll be looking at the current COVID-19 pandemic we're dealing with. The Black community in the United States really is hit from every angle and on all sides with this pandemic. Black people in this country are more likely to be essential workers, which has really been the nice way that people have defined those who work as your cashiers, as your food servers, as your custodial staff, and of course other professionals like teachers and so on that are essential medical staff. We're more likely to have those kinds of jobs. And then when we get sick, what we've seen from the COVID pandemic is that Blacks in the United States are more likely to become seriously ill and die from this disease. And now that a vaccine is available, we're also learning now that Black people are less likely to be vaccinated for a number of reasons. But one of them actually has to do with specifically the communities that the vaccines have been made available to, which are largely not underserved or underprivileged or socioeconomically disadvantaged Black populations.
Wow. Well, it's funny you mentioned that. That's actually a question that comes later, but I'm going to move it up. Talking about COVID-19 and the vaccinations and the distribution, how can doctors and healthcare professionals in the Black community convince the actual Black community about the efficacy and the safety of the vaccine?
Yeah, and that's really been a struggle. And I'm a cardiologist, as you know, but I've actually taken the time to talk to all of my patients about getting vaccinated, although that maybe some would argue that's not necessarily the vein of a cardiologist. But ultimately, I think the first step is to recognize that what's been called vaccine hesitancy does not come from an irrational or illogical place. There are legitimate reasons for Black people in the United States to be skeptical about a vaccine, especially one that was developed, it's being described as being developed quickly. And so, with the long history that there is in this country of mistreatment of Black people in healthcare in the United States, whether you're talking about the Tuskegee study or whether you're talking about the story of Henrietta Lacks, or even things which did not occur that long ago, where there were medical students that, when surveyed, actually believed that Black people experience pain differently from their white counterparts. And so we have these issues of bias in how medical care is delivered, not even mentioning whether or not there's actually access to that medical care. So I think the first step in addressing that is recognizing that any reluctance to receive the vaccine does not come from a place of ignorance or being uneducated or being a conspiracy theorist. I think that the first step toward actually achieving what we need to achieve, which is getting the entire population vaccinated, is to be honest about what that history has been. I think the second thing is to make sure that it's really understood what this pandemic has been, is, and is expected to continue being for some time. It's been horrific, it's been deadly. And my biggest concern as a physician is that we are getting to a place of what I've heard some people call COVID fatigue. It's just become a background noise sort of story where folks are thinking, well, I haven't gotten it yet. I'm wearing my mask. It's no real, it's no big deal. And, it's time for me to start getting back to my life. And meanwhile, our hospitals right now are overwhelmed as a result of what we saw happening out of Thanksgiving and Christmas, with people kind of getting a little bit lax, approaching a year entering the pandemic. So I think that making sure that it's understood that, number one, we don't know who's going to get infected. Number two, we don't know who among those that do get infected are going to do poorly. We have an idea, obviously, people with pre-existing conditions, but I can tell you that, we see plenty of people who we would have expected to do poorly do well, and we've seen people who are young and healthy do poorly. I think the next thing that we would need to do is to have people who have a platform use it to educate people. And so I myself have already been vaccinated. I received both of my doses. And I made a point of posting photos as well as my thoughts about and my experience with the vaccine on social media, and really have told everybody that will listen what my experience was and why I chose to do this. Quite frankly, I chose to do it for my parents. I chose to do it for my family members that I haven't hugged in nearly a year. I chose to do it because I'm worried that I'll bring this disease into my home. And so, having had it done, having had no adverse effect whatsoever, I think it's important to share that and to share the science. And the last thing I would say about this is that people refer to the vaccine's production as having been rushed. And the reality is that it really was anything but. It really wasn't rushed. And in fact, the anomaly was not so much securing emergency use authorization for a vaccine in 9 months. The anomaly really should have been seen as the fact that it typically took 7, 8 years to get various vaccines or medical therapies or what have you approved. And so what we saw that happened differently was that there was really unprecedented cooperation between government entities and the companies that are working on the vaccine. A lot of the red tape was minimized, and things that were typically done in series, step 1, step 2, step 3, were done a lot more efficiently and overlapped in such a way to allow for the efficiency and the speed that, frankly, we needed. I mean, we were in a pandemic, and still are, that has already, killed, approaching 500,000 people. We don't have the luxury of, we didn't have the luxury, I should say, of going through this and approaching this the way that we typically did. And so, really just impressing upon the people that we really want to reach. Number one, we understand why you're hesitant about this. Number two, this is where we are and what we're trying to prevent. And there's no guarantee that you will not find yourself among those who we've lost from this pandemic. And number three, the science is solid, and people that you know, people you respect, people who you will listen to are actually doing this.
Wow. Whole lot there.
Yeah.
We could probably go on for hours, but
Sure could.
moving on to a little bit softer kind of topic. Can you please describe the legacies of Dr. Mizel, Shirley, Sistrunk, and Morris, and the impact on Broward County and the healthcare system?
Sure, sure. I will admit I may not be the best person to answer that question because I'm not a Florida native. But when I moved down here and found that there were so many historic areas on Sistrunk Boulevard, and participating in the Martin Luther King Day Parade, and actually had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Shirley before his death. His daughters are friends, and I actually had the pleasure of playing golf with him once in his later years, and I did not realize the legend that he actually was at the at the time. And reading about these doctors and these pioneers, really what I can say is that we stand on their shoulders. I mean, really, wherever there are achievements, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. I think the only issue is whether or not we've actually named them. And I think that in the case of doctors Mizel and Shirley and Brown and even Dr. Bass, who you also interviewed, among many others, I think that these are the giants whose shoulders we stand on, and give us the perspective and the really the example to follow. I mean, they practiced at a time that it almost embarrasses me to talk about the obstacles I face. I mean, the obstacles that they faced and what they were able to accomplish and contribute to the community really can't be overstated.
So from the past to you, and then now to the future, what kind of advice could you pass on to Black youth if they're interested in following your career path to become a doctor?
Sure, sure. Well, I think first off, while I would say, of course, it's important for them to work hard and focus on academic achievement, I think it's also important um, to take the time to state that the culture of medical schools and medical school admissions is changing. And it really, the be all and end all is not really academics anymore. It's not your scores on standardized testing. It's really who you are as a person. What have you displayed that would lead an interviewer for medical school admission, for example, to accept that this is someone who actually has been walking the walk. This is someone who has been, dedicated to what he or she says they're in fact dedicated to. And so being, well-rounded for people who are interested in medical careers, I, for one, volunteered at hospitals and in research labs, and did those sorts of things. The other thing I would say is, wherever possible, identify a mentor as early as possible. And so I've actually, it's been a passion of mine, and I've tried my very best to make room and time for really, especially people from underrepresented groups, Black and Brown people in the United States who are interested in medicine, to be available as a resource to them, not only to give them exposure to what a life of medicine looks like in the form of things like shadowing, but also to be someone to give advice. Because I think that the biggest difference between many who succeed and many who don't is really having a model to follow. And with one of the obstacles you mentioned before, we're traditionally underrepresented in medicine. So maybe not everybody who's Black and Brown in the United States, personally knows a Black and Brown or Brown physician. But I think identifying a mentor and someone early, even if it's not somebody in the exact area you're interested in, it might be a chemist, it might be a biochemist. They may know someone who can make a connection to someone who is more aligned with what that particular person thinks their interests are at that time. So I would say mentorship is critical.
Well, that seems to be a theme so far. When I talked to Dr. Bass the other day, he said the same thing. You got to find a mentor, someone that guides you, because so many people have not had that exposure, and they may not know a doctor. And in our case, lawyers, they may not have been exposed to lawyers. So you need to connect with someone that kind of breaks through that myth that it's unattainable. So
Exactly. Absolutely.
wonderful. Doctor, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, you know what? Before we go, I'm going to ask you this. Can you convey any story as you were, going through it and becoming a doctor that you think would be worthy of passing on to youth, or just a great story?
Wow. There are a few. I
Going
would,
through medical school,
yeah,
not sleeping for days. I don't, tell me.
yeah. Medical training is kindler and gentler today, I'd have to say. But my generation, I would say, was probably the last that went through, um, what was classically, the real tough residency training. Going on 2 days with no sleep sort of stuff. We have mandates now in medical training that really have all but eliminated that. But I would say probably I did my medical training in Boston. I was a resident from 1998 to 2001, and so we were kind of in the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. That was kind of an interesting period to go through, where nowadays HIV is not really the death sentence that it was then, and people, are not really populating medical wards today with HIV and AIDS related complications as they were back then. And so that really was kind of a trial by combat, a sort of experience, seeing these patients who also were typically from the socioeconomic disadvantaged, typically Black and brown, at least in the inner city Boston area where I trained. And that was challenging, because when those patients got sick, they got very sick, and they needed a lot of attention. They needed a lot of procedures. And as a medical resident, it rested upon you to do all of those things. And you were never allowed to go home until your work was done. And your work was done when your patient was, as we used to say, tucked in. And so if your patient wasn't tucked in, you were there for the long haul, and you had no idea when you were going home. This was not shift work. That had its benefits and it had its drawbacks. I think in the end, I'd like to believe we're in a better place now in terms of how people are trained. But it was certainly a rough several years.
Thank you. Doctor, appreciate you sharing your personal story. That always just makes it more human. And thank you for your service
Thank you. Thank you.
to
Thank
our
you.
community. You make it a safer and better community. And for taking your time and spending this afternoon and chatting with me a little bit.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Thanks for having
Wonderful.
me.
And our audience, thank you for being with us, Dr. Alexis, and have a wonderful day, everyone.